So I'm Meg.
I'm Alex.
So we are ReThinkingQueer.
Just the two of us. So as a quick background, even though it says it on here, I wanted to read it out again. ReThinkingQueer is a new and undergraduate lecture series at Penn, aiming to heighten the level of critical discourse surrounding queer and trans identity and current socio-political issues by highlighting marginalized voices and perspectives from within the LGBTQI spectrum. We emphasize the intersectionality of experience under oppression, thus building coalitions across divisive identity politics in an attempt to link our multiple struggles into a strong movement of many towards collective liberation for all.
Okay. And on that note, we're pleased to introduce Eric Stanley and Angela Davis. Eric Stanley works at the intersections of radical trans queer politics, theories of state violence, and visual culture. He is currently finishing a PhD in the History of Consciousness program at UC Santa Cruz and continues to organize with Dave Shane. He edited Captive Genders, Trans Embodiment in the Prison Industrial Complex with Nat Smith, which is out for sale outside, and co-directed the films Homotopia and Criminal Queers with Chris Vargas, which we screened at Penn last spring. And it is our great pleasure that we welcome Eric back to Penn with his esteemed mentor and advisor, Angela Davis, a woman who requires no introduction, as she's giving the keynote address tomorrow night for the Critical Refusals Conference at 6:30 at Irvine Auditorium, which is on the corner of 34th and Spruce. She is a model for all of us who work to bridge academia and activism in our lives.
So thanks everybody for coming out tonight. We hope you will enjoy the rich and intimate conversation between Eric and Angela. After their discussion, we're going to open the floor to questions from you all. So thanks for coming.
Thank you so much to ReThinkingQueer and specifically to Alex and Meg for bringing this event to us. Yeah, it's really great. Thank you for all your unpaid labor that happens to make these kinds of things happen. So tonight we're going to talk, I'm going to start off talking a little bit about the book, and then we're going to have a little conversation, and we're going to open it up for all of us to have a conversation. So Captive Genders, right here, it's for sale outside. I recommend you get it. I mean, yeah. Not because of my or Nat our amazingness, but because of all the amazing voices that are here in this book, and all the really important and historically and still marginalized voices that we try to bring together. And Angela and I were just talking on the car ride over here, and this book in waves kind of began through an independent study that I did with Angela 7 years ago. So it's been a long time in the making. We were also talking about how it seems like possibly if it would have come out earlier, there wasn't necessarily an audience for it. But now there's something about this historic moment that we're living in right now that is ready and excited to think about trans and queer issues and abolishing the prison industrial complex. So we have a lot of work to do tonight. But the kind of aim of the book was to center the experience and the theoretical landscape of trans and queer people and trans and queer studies within the larger field of prison studies, critical prison studies. You know, we know from personal experience and just through, friends, lovers, what have you, that trans and queer folks, especially trans and queer folks of color, disabled folks, differently abled folks, marginally housed folks experience relentless forms of personal and state violence. And we also know that those forms of state violence oftentimes take the form of the prison industrial complex. Although there are no actual statistics for various reasons that we can talk about during the Q&A, one study, the only study that has actually been done, that was done by an aid service provider in San Francisco, of the community that they surveyed, 74% of the trans women that they had contact with had at some point been caught up in prison industrial complex. Right? So that's a shocking number, even to those of us who know a lot about incarceration. And so this project was really about centering trans and queer folks in terms of the PIC, and also attempting to push the larger LGBT movement towards thinking about abolition and the politics of abolition and the need to think critically about prisons and not rely on prisons and their claims to safety. And so that's kind of what the book was about. It has a wide range of pieces. We talked about later in the Q&A as well. We also thought Nat Smith, who was the other co-editor, and I, started from a place of wanting to make sure voices of currently and formerly incarcerated people were in, vital parts of the book. And so we have a number of people writing from trans and queer identified people writing from prison, or people that spent a lot of time in prison. And that was kind of our political point of view. So these are kind of the constellation that is made this book. So tonight, we're just going to have a little chat, fireside chat. So I'm going to start off asking.
Right ahead.
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone.
So I wanted to think with you for a moment about something that you say in your book, Our Prison's Obsolete, which is another great book, which is outside for sale through the Women's Shoe. And you make an argument there that prison is a gendering apparatus. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and especially in terms of what that might mean for trans or gender non-conforming folks.
Well, I would begin by saying that prisons are they constitute perhaps the most intransigent institution in our society. If you look at the extent to which prisons have or have not changed over the last 2 centuries, you get a sense of the extent to which they shelter conventions, and they are refuges. There are places where obsolete ideologies reside. And they're also places that rely on a kind of taking for grantedness. We take for granted that prisons are there to help create safety for the free society. We take for granted the racism that is so thoroughly entrenched in the structures of prisons. We take for granted. And as a matter of fact, you can say that that racism is so thoroughly entrenched that we don't recognize it anymore. It's a part of the structure. Now, we also take for granted that there are men's prisons and women's prisons. I was thinking back over the decades I've been involved in doing prison work for the vast majority of my life. And I can remember when I had a kind of epiphany about the fact that prisons were not simply about men. Unfortunately, it was when I ended up being arrested myself that I realized that I had been doing work around political prisoners and prisons, but had never thought about the very specific ways that women are affected by these institutions. And as a matter of fact, we eventually came to see that if we look, even though women constitute a small minority, if we look at the prison and the prison industrial complex from the vantage point of women's experiences and women's histories, we learn a lot, not only about the way in which this institution affects women, but about the institution as a whole. Now, the taken for grantedness of the gender binary that is incorporated in the prison is what I think we want to talk about this evening. How that taken for grantedness serves as a technology of gender, not only inside the prison but in the larger society. is that if we're interested in contesting the rigid gender binaries in general, it might be very important to look at the institution of prison, even though you may not be primarily interested in prison issues, prison abolition. That is a place where we have to focus our analyses and our activism. Now, I'm going to talk to you. Most prisons, we know, well, first of all, let me say that prisons are these monstrous classificatory apparatuses. Everything is about classification. It's about classification in terms of what kind of prisoner you are and what kind of crime you committed. And it's about, classifying gender. So most, well, almost all prisons direct people to a men's prison or women's prison in accordance with the genitals that they link to gender. And so this creates a huge set of problems, a huge set of issues. And the book, Captive Genders, is such an amazing book. You really, Eric can tell you that you have to buy this book. I would say you have to buy this book because it is so enlightening. You will learn so much. And you will see how looking very specifically at trans issues in prison, you get a sense of what the institution does that you would not have been able to acquire had not you examined how prisons address issues of gender. And I'll stop
I guess something that is really interesting to me, and because we've talked a lot about politics over the years, is the way in which this current moment, the LGBT mainstream is, clinging onto and reproducing this idea of normalcy via, gay marriage, gays in the military, and hate crimes legislation. We just recently, almost exactly a year ago, Obama signed the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. And the signing of this act has been championed by almost, the entirety of the mainstream LGBT movement as, a step forward in the fight against hate, right? There's all these kinds of discourses that are out there and reproduced by these organizations to make us think that this law and putting more people in prison is going to make us safer, right? And like I was saying before, we know that trans and queer people face enormous amounts of violence. And so what I'm interested in is how can we hold the reality of the violence that we face, in our analysis, but also have a really strong analysis of hate crimes legislation. And I know that there's this is also another interesting story. There's the force codes, which came into being during Reconstruction, came into being to attempt to curtail the massive amounts of lynching that was happening. And then what eventually happened was that they were used against black folks who were congregating in public, right? And so that is a kind of historical, historical moment. How can we use that to think about this moment of hate crimes?
Well, I was thinking about my own political history, and I was involved with an organization in the 1970s that produced the first model legislation for what is now called hate crimes. It was National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, just shortly after I was released from jail myself. We didn't call it hate crimes legislation. We called it legislation against racist and anti-Semitic crimes. And of course, you never know what the eventual consequences of the work that you do are going to be. You know, as Stuart Hall says, there are never any guarantees. And so I can remember, you know, all of the work we did against the Ku Klux Klan, marching in Raleigh, North Carolina. This was the context for trying to compel the state to take some action against groups like the Ku Klux Klan. And then later, as you point out, Eric, these laws have been used in very regressive ways. As a matter of fact, I think it's in North Carolina, where they finally began to use the anti-lynching legislation that people have been struggling with, as you pointed out, for so long. And the description of lynching was, if I remember correctly, 3 or more people who gang up to assault another person. And so if you look at the records of who got charged under this anti-lynching legislation, it was black boys primarily. And then can you imagine what they think about the category lynching? You know, they're the perpetrators of lynching. All connections with the history of lynching are completely lost. But the point I wanted to make about the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd hate crimes legislation was that what's the guy's name? James Byrd, who was just executed. No, he was executed on the same day that Troy Davis was executed. It's funny, we all forget his name. I think it was Lawrence Brewer or something. Is that it? Oh, wow, I can't believe my memory still works like that. But he had indicated that he had no regrets at all, that he would do it again. However, James Byrd's son campaigned passionately to prevent the execution. And that ought to tell us something about the ways in which the hate crime legislation mechanically formulated as a way to address, I suppose, disappear the perpetrator without actually addressing the problem, without, in the case of James Byrd, without actually figuring out what we do to purge the society of the racism that has afflicted us for so long. And with the case of Matthew Shepard, to figure out, you know, how can we begin to develop strategies to minimize and reduce and eventually abolish homophobia and transphobia. The problem with these criminal justice-based laws is that they prevent us from paying serious attention to the social problem, underlying social problem. And this is the larger function of prisons. Prisons disappear the problems which they report to solve. But as a matter of fact, they become modes of reproducing homophobia, reproducing racism, reproducing the violence that is so much a part of both of those modes of oppression.
the contributors to the book who are currently incarcerated talk about the kind of relentless violence that they exist in. You know, it's a kind of never-ending total war every day, every night. There is really no night, no day. And specifically, or two of them specifically, are trans women of color writing from inside, and they talk a lot about, you know, sometimes the violence that they face at the hands of other prisoners, but what they actually focus on is the ways in which they experience violence at the hands of the CO, the corrections officers. And I was wondering if you could kind of think with us a little bit more about the place of violence inside prison. And you know, there are all these attempts to make a safer, more healthy, more affirming prison. You know, a prison with less violence. You know, and many of us believe that a prison with less violence would be a prison that didn't exist. I was wondering if you could think a little bit more about the kind of, yeah, the kind of statement, the kind of place of violence and inside.
Well, I think you're absolutely right that the violence exists because prisons are such violence. Violence is a part of the everyday regimes. It's not that it's something that can be gotten rid of. It's not. What happens is that violence also gets naturalized. The assumption is, oh, this is where all of the bad people are, and therefore we will find violence. But my sense is that violence is absolutely necessary to the function. And the institution itself nourishes the violence. It needs the violence. It's interesting the way in which oftentimes the sexual violence is represented. When you think about men's prison, and we think about sexual violence, right? Well, this is the one thing that everybody thinks they know about what it's like to be in a men's prison. You watch any of the TV programs and the cops, they're always warning the people they arrest, if you don't confess, or if you don't do this, you'll find yourself in prison, and you will be the target of rape. I mean, they may try to say it in less overt ways, but that's the whole point. Prisons are places where men violently sexually assault the people with whom they share that space. Then, of course, when you're talking about trans women who are in men's prisons, the assumption is, well, you have all these violent men there already, and obviously the easiest targets are going to be trans women. And the violence is attributed to the individual. And this has become even worse during this era of neoliberalism, globalization, and all that. The individual has become the hyper-individualization that the way we function. So I think we have to ask ourselves, how the violence stops the prison. It's not that it's something that can be removed or purged. Stop rape. Yeah, that's very important. But I think prison authorities rely on rape to guarantee that the institution is going to continue to function smoothly. This is where abolition comes in. So we would definitely have to develop an abolition strategy in order to get at those contradictions and in order to prevent the structural reproduction of the violence.
Maybe one more question. And this, I think, so thinking about abolition and the ways in which abolition helps us think about how prison is built through, racialized brutality, through violence against certain people, and which this brings me to the last question, which is around the kind of argument for gender-responsive prisons. This has been happening for the last 5 years in California, specifically, and elsewhere. The argument, which is actually made through a lot of feminist discourse, is that we need to create prisons that are more, kind of more accountable. I actually was just reading a document where I used that word, which is kind of more accountable to the needs of women specifically, but some of them go as far as to say, gender non-conforming people. And so it's this moment when a lot of the discourses that we helped develop and thinking critically about gender seem like they're coming back upon us. And I was wondering if you would think a little bit about gender-responsive prisons, which are.
Well, I think I would begin by saying that if you look at the history of the institution of the prison, you see over decades the replication of the same issues, the same problems. The reform, as a matter of fact, this whole question of gender-responsive prisons historically recapitulates the 1870s when women's prisons were introduced on a larger scale, when the reformatory movement. And the idea was that women needed special places. And of course, if you know something about the discourse of that era, the notion was that men could benefit from prison. They could become perhaps better citizens. They could be rehabilitated. But women who committed crimes had fallen so low that there was no way that they could be rehabilitated. And so the reformers argued, yes, women can be rehabilitated, women can be reformed, but they need special places. They need women's prisons. And they need places where they can be taught how to be true women. So they need to live in a cottage-type environment. They need to learn how to cook and learn how to sew and wash and iron. And this is how the prisons were conceptualized for women, as spaces for women to be able to rediscover their femininity. And I see this happening with gender-responsive prisons, because the argument is that there are gender differences and we have to create the institutions that are going to acknowledge those gender differences. And so you have these, you have the prison authorities getting training on gender difference. Like, what's the difference between men and women? And then, as Eric pointed out, sometimes also in California, there's some training around trans issues. As a matter of fact, some members were in visit with a group of professors from the University of California to Vacaville prison, and one of the professors said to one of the guards, "Oh, I didn't know you had transvestite prisoners here." This is the University of California professor. And the guard corrected him. He said, "Oh, you mean transgender prisoners?" but, and you know, circumstances, I don't know. So now, yeah, this again, these arguments are being recapitulated, but they're being mobilized in support of the expansion of the prison industrial complex. And so when the gender responsive prisons came up in California, that was about 2006 or something like that, the idea was to empty one of the largest women's prisons in California, which is the largest women's prison in the world. There are two women's prisons in Chowchilla, Central California Women's Facility, Valley State Prison, right across the street from each other, and they vied for the position of being the largest women's prisons in the entire world. And so the idea was to shut down one of these so that the overcrowdedness of men's prisons could be mitigated. So to use that one to hold male prisoners and to create these small gender-responsive prisons that would be closer to the communities where the women came from. And interestingly enough, there were some private corporations involved who would then, profit from the building of these new many prisons. And I should just say, this is such an interesting story, and it's told in one of the articles by Vanessa, right? Vanessa Martin. It's a really interesting story. Justice Now, which is the organization that she worked with, promoted a campaign within the prison and got over 3,000 women prisoners to sign a petition against gender responsive prisons, which was absolutely amazing because in many ways you might say that their most immediate interest, that they would be closer to family and so forth, might lie in supporting this new strategy that our governor and as a result of that petitioning and work that a lot of organizations did, the whole program was discarded, at least temporarily. You may know about the overcrowdedness in California, and the fact that California is still under federal injunction to release 30 to 40,000 prisoners, but what they're doing now is they're transferring them from state prison to county jail. So they just cannot. And what was so interesting was that many of those who argued for the gender responsive prisons would say, well, these women, they're no danger to anyone. So they shouldn't be in this maximum security prison in Chowchilla. They can be in these minimum security, small women's prisons. Well, if there were no danger, why not release them? You see, I mean, the easiest thing would have been to release all of those women that they were imagining as being the new population of the small gender responsive many women. Anything to avoid decarceration. Anything to avoid a strategy that might lead to abolition.
So we're going to open it up for questions in a minute. But first, I wanted to acknowledge Shay Gossett, who has an amazing piece in the book, and Harala, and who's sitting back there. Yeah, that's amazing. There's a lot of collective knowledge in this room. And there's also going to be a reading at the A Space on Saturday. But we're so does anybody have a question?
A couple of years ago, I read Victoria Wall's book on women in prison, and there was a chapter on solidarity.
Yeah, I mean, there's TGIJP, which is Transgender Gender Variant Intersex Justice Project, which is based out of San Francisco. And its membership and its leadership are formerly incarcerated trans women of color, organize a lot of people that are still inside, mainly at the medical unit and backfill. And so there's a lot of, inside-outside solidarity. A lot of those folks are organizing right now inside prisons. I mean, more largely, there's the prison hunger strikes that have been happening, and that's a massively important and well-hidden reality that, most recently just ended. But, and those were primarily in Pelican Bay around issues of solitary confinement, being locked down for 23 hours a day. A state of torture beyond most forms of torture that you can imagine. And the book also talks more about people organizing inside, but that's something that's really important to the book and I think to abolitionist politics writ large, right? I mean, as someone who's currently not in prison, my kind of goal is how can I support folks who are inside doing this organizing, right? That's what I see as my place. Whatever, but that's kind of like, the people that are currently incarcerated or formerly incarcerated are the experts on this topic, and their voices need to be placed at the center of all these
Hey, I want to thank both of you. I am located in Austin, Texas, and I teach at Texas State University. And I was a part of doing death penalty abolition work in Texas. And also, I'm part of a group in Austin called Project ABC All Bodies Count, and we're trying to do healthcare initiatives for trans people in Texas. And of course, we've come across trans issues in the prison system, particularly when we're doing our LGBT immigrant work, being in Texas. The Hutto prison system, the Hutto prison centers, and the immigrant detention centers that are women's prisons. They're filled with women and children, and activists had to push to even get the children outside for an hour a day because they're literally family prisons. So we were asking, are there any LGBT prisoners? And nobody can give us any information on them. I'm wondering, and also the people in our group, Project All Bodies Count. There's many trans men in the group who don't want to have their gender markers changed in Texas because they're afraid of being sent to a men's prison for whatever offense that they might come across as being a gender variant. And I was wondering if you had any information on prisons in Texas and what's going on with trans men, particularly outside of the state of California and maybe New York, and also anything with these new immigrant detention centers and how gender operates, particularly queer gender, in these would be amazing if you had any information.
Well, this Julia's article in your book called Abolition, and she worked with trans prisoners in Canada and primarily in Canada and a couple of the states. So that would be something that you might want to yourself. Julia Sudbury, a rural abolitionist.
Other people have resources. I mean, anything to answer that question, maybe?
Well, can I piggyback on that? It's such an honor to be here in your space, but I attended the University of Houston in all men's. I teach gender in all men's prisons in the state penitentiary, and you haven't touched on teaching in this talk, and I was hoping you have something more to add to your advocacy of teaching, and how has that involved in the issue of teaching transgender prisons, and is that something that has been revitalized in the last go around this? I know, I mean, we can't
resistant, but some kind of subversive strategies that will allow you to do that work without necessarily placing yourself in jeopardy. That if you do work in prisons, you have to figure out those kinds of things all the time. I haven't taught for a long time. I did teach at the San Francisco Jail for quite a while, but I have trouble getting into prison. So, but I can tell you an interesting experience that I had in a prison in Washington State, where I was addressing. It was a men's prison, and I was addressing a rather large group of primarily black men. There were some Latino men and some Native men, a few, and just a couple of white men. One of the men asked me a question about fatherless families and, the whole discourse about the black absent father. And so I said, if you studied feminist theory, you might formulate that question differently. And I thought that I was picking a fight, all of these men, I'm like raising feminists. But, and I said you should, especially, there are a lot of black feminists that you should read. And interestingly enough, he wanted to know the names of some of the black feminists I was referring to. And asked afterwards, there was a graduate student who taught there, she'd actually brought me in, and asked her whether or not it might be possible to organize a course on feminism for the guys. And it was so interesting because nobody was smiling. It was like total seriousness. They wanted to know. And I don't think that people realize the extent to which it is possible to have those kinds of conversations with people in prison. And one of the things I will say is that people who manage to survive, particularly long terms, are people who learn how to live the life of the mind. They're people who teach themselves and who study. And I tell some of my students, I said, they're better students than you are. Because that is all they do. They read, they write, and they think all day long. Yeah. So, given the fact that under the Clinton administration, all of the, so many of the educational programs were dismantled, that's something that's on our agenda. Because as abolitionists, we don't not demand change within the prisons as they are, but we relate that change to the needs of people who are there, and we try to guarantee that change will not produce better prisons. So you don't want to have a curriculum on gender and transgender that is going to in some way promote the permanency of incarcerated genders, but rather one that leads to a abolition.
We'll go here. Yes,
Me?
Sure.
Yeah, sorry. So throughout the talk, throughout the talk, you sort of gestured towards some essential characteristics of prisons in our society today. They're intransigent, they're taken for granted, they are fueled sort of by structural violence, they classify people, they produce gender. And I guess I was thinking about this list of characteristics, and I was thinking that they could equally apply to schools. And so I was wondering, can we think the prison industrial complex without also thinking the school inside of that complex.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I do think that there is a connection. Well, of course, anybody who's read Foucault makes the connection. But if we look at the extent to which the culture that gets produced within systems is transferred and leads out the horrendous transphobia within systems gets reproduced in the free world and also within schools. And if we think about, some of the cases, there was a case of that young boy, Lawrence King down in California, I think, a couple of years ago, who wore high shoes and lipstick. And a student killed him. And the discussion, of course, was about, whether this other student should be tried as an adult. And that completely obfuscated the problem. Where did this high school kid learn to so passionately hate people who were gender non-conforming that he would bring a gun to school and shoot this boy? So I think it's really important to look at the two institutions together. And a lot of people have tried to do this, schools not jails, education not incarceration, but we don't want to assume that the education or the schools are the answer, because they already embody the influence and the impact of these institutions of incarceration.
So about a year ago, a group of folks based in Oakland came through talking about the sort of what happened around Oscar Grant being killed and the repercussions of that. And one of the things that they argued was that from their perspective, an abolitionist and anti-racist point of view was to call for a lengthy sentence for the police officer who killed him as a way to keep the state accountable to the community. And I don't feel like I know enough about the issue to take a position on that, but I was curious about your thoughts on that, and also kind of connected to like the policing of like neighborhoods or the West Village or the Castro, and like looking to like what that accountability looks like. Those being two possible examples.
Yeah, the book talks a lot about, a lot of us know from personal experience, the ways in which transgender, non-conforming, and queer youth get expelled from neighborhoods, right, because of the ways in which certain bodies are understood to drive down property values and to scare off business and all these. For example, in San Francisco, I used to be a homeless queer youth a long time ago, and when I first arrived in San Francisco, they were trying to build a shelter for LGBT youth in San Francisco. And it was actually the Gay Business District Association that fought and successfully got it not to happen in Castro, right? There's this way, and we've been doing this before, we've been talking about this a lot, the ways in which we're all implicated in some way or another in reproducing the logics of the prison. Right? And so this is one example of, people reproducing a certain kind of, it's a lot of it, it's also a material reality of which bodies get to belong where and when. So that's just, something thinking about the ways that, certain spaces that are, and possibly especially spaces that are, and believe themselves to be more open or more inclusive, actually have these really violent, exclusionary ideologies and practices built into them.
Yeah, and I think the question of officer who killed Oscar Grant is related to the question of prison sentences for people who engage in homophobia and trans violence. And it's a difficult question because particularly when you're close to a situation and your emotions are already completely constructed by these institutions and structures we're talking about. You feel that if somebody else ends up doing a long sentence, and certainly this white police officer who shot Oscar Grant should go to prison for a long time, at least longer than 1.5 years, and ended up. But my position would be that that really absolves us of the responsibility of dealing with the problem. And with the Oscar Grant issue, it wasn't just a question of the death of Oscar Grant. It was a question of a police department that is so violent, and you've probably seen the YouTube videos of the breakup of Occupy Oakland. I mean, this is the police department in our town. And they continue, I could talk to you about so many other examples of police violence and police crimes. You're not going to get rid of that simply by sending individuals to prison. So even though the individual has to be held accountable, let us not allow the prison to serve as this way that diverts us. It's a diversion, really. It diverts us from addressing the real problem. And I had a lot of arguments with people because I said, yeah, what's his name?
Last night we did an event at Blue Stockings in Ruthie Gilmore. We were talking about the kind of claim of Angela Davis, and she was the person that was also a student. Yeah, she said, what if she claimed I am him, and we would have to collectively figure out that reality. So I just think that, and there's lots of discussions around, how abolition is actually, a politics for guilty and putting that sort of scarecrow. But starting there, into abolition and those really tricky moments, I think, is what really makes sense. Many people will, agree that, non-violent offenders, right, should and can be released, but the kind of, the points where the conversations get tricky and seems to be
So I'm wondering exactly how prison abolition can be affected without radical reformulation in society generally, like some kind of revolution. And I think this is connected with another line of inquiry that I'm interested in, that is kind of classing the issue of prison abolition. And so can we really think about the project of prison abolition, especially with its relationship with the disciplinary apparatus of gender, independently from some kind of radical working class political activity, both inside and outside the prison, seeing as the prison industrial complex is so integral to the current functioning of capital?
No.
And that's what we've been talking about relating to queer and trans issues. It's not just about the institution of the prison itself. It's about the larger socio-economic, political situation. So, no, we can't
always struck by the way in which school-wide discipline programs sort of serve as another space of where obviously ideologies continue forming the way that we respond to getting in trouble and suspensions, and which is the way that we treat them, particularly if they're not color. And I'm concerned particularly with these recent suicides of youth who have been up in the LGBT community, and the response of these sort of zero tolerance anti-bullying campaigns. And I'm concerned that this is getting at the same problem.
I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's, well, maybe we can talk about that.
Yeah, to agree with you, I think that we need to be really careful when we start with anti-bullying campaigns. I mean, I was kicked out of 2 different schools. A regular school and then a school for troubled people. But I did it. And a lot of that was related to the ways in which I was assailed, and this is like not it's so incredibly common, right? It was really suicide or homicide just felt like my options. And what is really important, I think, is that we acknowledge how anti-trans and queer violence is so incredibly systemic. I mean, the primary, people that bullied me were the teachers and the administrators. I mean, kids did things to me, but they could not do anything like what they did. So I think that that's really important when we think about anti-bullying campaigns, right? It's not about wearing purple. And wearing purple might obscure us from the possibility of actually, collectively thinking critically about the ways that, anti-trans and queer violence is so fundamental to our educational system. I mean, that's what I was saying. So, and so thinking about ReThinkingQueer, how can we build, a critical analysis of gender into, really young education, right? It shouldn't be everything is everything, and then all of a sudden they take a, feminist studies class, and then all of a sudden they think critically, which is what actually happens for most of them. That's what actually happens. And so that's why it's so instrumental, so important, I think, to, work, place these analysis, in this kind of education. Good luck with that. That's a lot I'm dreaming.
Restorative justice programs and schools have been doing good work. My sister works with, she's the executive director of an organization that's called Restorative Justice for Oakland. And they go into schools and they teach kids how to talk to each other. And most of the schools, they spend time, and within a relatively short period of time, the violence ends. And she was telling me the story the other day. She said there was this kid who got into a fight a couple of blocks away from the school, and somebody in the neighborhood who knew about the program brought him back to the school. And he said, "We can't fight at school now, we can't even fight in the neighborhood." But it was interesting that they have, developed ways of addressing, they've learned how to talk, they've acquired a vocabulary that they didn't have before, and therefore they had to engage in that kind of violence.
Hi. So my father's been incarcerated, for most of my life, and out of jail in prison most of my life, and he shares a story of finding God, right, and converting to Islam through prison work or through his time in prisons. And this is a story that shared by many men and women. And so my question is, how does faith and spirituality intersect with this project of organizing, both in and out of prisons, in light of and these other pieces around Islamophobia in society, et cetera. And also religion, to be honest, as this space for conformity to happen within prisons as well. So would love to hear you thinking about that.
That's a huge question, and I think you touched at touch on some of the contradictions. Historically, usually Christian religious organizations have had access to prisons, and this is true today. But people who have organized Muslims have done amazing work. As a matter of fact, you know the story of Malcolm X, how he became a Muslim, and that was linked with his acquiring literacy and learning how to read and write and so forth and so on. I would say I do think spirituality is important. The problem is that most people in prison do not have access to modes of spirituality other than the most traditional and oftentimes fundamental forms of Christianity. So there's some really good programs around yoga and meditation have done a lot of important work behind bars. I would say that we should really think about, as someone who does yoga, I think yoga is, I learned how to do yoga when I was in jail myself from a book. And I was in solitary confinement, almost the entire time. And it was really, really helpful. It allowed me to get through what would otherwise have been much, much more difficult period. Although I always say having been a graduate student for many years, it was a lot less difficult because I hadn't learned how to sit for hours and writing and doing what students do. So here's another connection.